Stay tuned for Cynthia Thurlow. Okay, I finally have the amazing Cynthia Thurlow back on the podcast to talk about midlife and why we might want to put a pause on it and look at how we're aging to be our best self in the future. Cynthia, thanks for joining me finally.
Of course, of course. Such a pleasure. And thanks for your patience. Writing book number two was quite a journey for sure.
I don't understand how you do it all.
Uh, well, what I would say is, and I think that, life happens around a business, and 2024 was a bear. So I think writing became something that allowed me to feel like I could not think about sad things going on around me. So for me, it was probably a passion project. And then add on to it, it was a welcome distraction from
Hmm.
some otherwise kind of sad things that happened in 2024. Thankfully, though, my husband's on the mend. But 2024 ended with a lot. There was just a lot
Yeah.
of hospitalizations and surgeries, and just grateful to have it behind me. So when you say, how do you do it all? I think it is I think sometimes, those distractions are a blessing when there's a
Hmm.
lot going on. And, everyone is different, but for me, I can focus like just about, I have an ability to focus under pressure, unlike most people. And I think that's been fine tuned over the years of working in medicine and realizing, you have to put your blinders on and just focus on the next thing to do.
Well, I always say you look amazing, and your skin, I must add in, always looks just perfect and
Oh,
really healthy.
that's so
So
nice. That's so nice.
taking care of yourself is doing something.
I
Something's
try. I
working.
try. Well, I mean, it's the things that you talk about. I mean, how important nutrition is and sleep and exercise. And if you're not doing that, there's no pill or potion or powder that's going to fix it. So,
Hmm.
doing, the very foundational elements that we learn in our training, that's the stuff that really makes a difference ultimately. And it's not, like one supplement or
Hmm.
special concoction that someone on, TikTok has convinced you is going to solve all your ills of the world. It really is lifestyle that's most important.
Yes, and we both talk about taking a holistic approach. And I must say to our listeners that I met you and Dr. Anna Quebeca and Dr. Gabrielle Lyon pre-pandemic nutritional therapy conference. I just think how far the three of you have come since then, 5 years later, the impact you are all making on improving the aging process for men and women. It's pretty amazing what's gone on the last 5 years in our space.
Yeah, thank you. No, it is, that's when I actually met Gabrielle. I knew Anna before then. And yes, it's amazing to see what friends and colleagues, the work that we're all doing to help, support men and women navigating, you know, middle age and beyond. Isn't that really what it's all about? And I feel very grateful to have the opportunity to be in a position where I can, impact more lives than when I was just seeing patients in an office or in a
Mhm.
hospital. That's ultimately what it comes down to. So yeah, the pandemic, what a wild ride. That conference that we all spoke at, we had no idea. I mean, the pandemic, literally, it was like
The
maybe a
next
week or two
day,
later, the whole world shut down.
yeah, we're
Literally,
ahead.
we had no idea.
No, but I think it's looking back at how, what you were all speaking of 5 years ago and how where we are today and just getting that message out on prioritizing protein, getting our exercise in, and really what I would say, not blaming the aging process, but taking a pause as you talk about midlife and reassessing, am I doing all the right things to improve my future self? Do I need to stop and reassess because what I was doing for the last 20, 30 years isn't working anymore. And I need to figure out how to stop blaming, oh, I'm getting older, as the doctors will tell me. That's just your new normal, but really learn the tools to apply to ourselves now so we can thrive as we get older. And as I keep saying, not struggle as we watch our parents pass away and parents getting, or mothers getting older, and just really for me is watching what happens as I was texting you from Palm Desert. Like, okay, these people, we don't have to look like that. Why
I
don't we
know.
start now at age 50, 45, So talk about what's your purpose. What do you feel you're most excited about to share this?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so much in what you just said that kind of conventional allopathic medicine is designed to help people when they're dealing with urgencies and emergencies. We were not trained to talk about a great deal of really preventative lifestyle measures. And so when I think about what my purpose is at this point in my life, I left traditional clinical medicine 9 years ago as of April 1st. It was a big anniversary. Next year it'll be 10. I'll have to do something along with the book coming out to acknowledge that. But I think for so many of us, it's course correcting because a lot of the very healthy behaviors that got us to where we were in our early 40s are really maladaptive for middle age and beyond. And that's not to suggest that there's anything wrong with the aging process. In fact, I am more confident, strong, healthy now than I was 15 years ago with, two little kids and, a very stressful job, a husband traveling. And so I think that when we're reflecting on the differentiators for our generation, because our generation is helping to change the narrative, I think about our parents' generation that, there just wasn't an emphasis on, physical activity, certainly not like it is now. There wasn't an emphasis on prioritizing sleep. It was a very much a drinking culture. I mean, I have a parent who predeceased my mother, but he was a big drinker, and my father-in-law was a big drinker, and so it was kind of glorified smoking, drinking, all these habits that certainly our generation probably thinks very differently about. But when I think about one of the big differentiators is just being physically active. I've always been physically active, but what I did in my 20s and 30s just completely burned me out in my early 40s. I talk very openly about I hit a wall in perimenopause. I had never been weight loss resistant. I easily lost weight after pregnancies. And all of a sudden, my hormones were working against me and not for me. And the types of exercise I was doing at that point in my life that were very intense conditioning classes, spin classes, running, were wearing my body out. And so there was an entire year, Debbie, of my 40s where all I did was walk. I had completely trashed my adrenals and I had to relearn the types of exercise that didn't leave me worn out because that was my tell was that if I did something too intense and the next day I felt like I could barely get out of bed, something was clearly wrong. And so I had to re-engineer everything I was doing. And for full transparency, even though I've been weight training for more than 20 years, even that had to change last year. More intensity, heavier weights. And so I look at it as a trajectory of our lifetime. The word pause and perimenopause and menopause gives us opportunities to stop and reflect. And as frustrating as it can be when, like, as an example, what are women most concerned about is when they become weight loss resistant, because in their mindset, they've been conditioned to believe that if they exercise more, they eat less, they restrict their calories, they fast more, that is going to be the magic bullet for them to lose weight. And all of a sudden that doesn't work. Things really do change can significantly in perimenopause and menopause, but it gives us an opportunity to kind of get reacquainted with very foundational elements. What do we eat? Are we prioritizing sleep? What type of exercise are we doing? And it's not just the weight training, it's the non-exercise induced thermogenesis. It's just being physically active throughout the day. Like I tell everyone, that any given day I'm walking anywhere from 12 to 15,000 steps. And it's not that I'm just on a treadmill for hours on end. It's that I make a conscientious effort, even when I'm working. Like when I'm done with this podcast, I'll probably go up and down the stairs just to get myself up and moving. But it's that kind of conscientious effort to be physically active. Because what I watched during the pandemic was that both my parents got more frail. And that was very sad. My parents have been divorced for a long time. My dad was taking care of my stepmother, who has had at that time end stage Alzheimer's. My mom and stepfather, they at that time they lived in Michigan and they were very fearful. They felt like they were afraid to leave their house. They were afraid to interact with others. And they just continued to lose more muscle. So they became more frail. And I was actually shocked the first time I saw my mom halfway through the pandemic when I realized like she had lost a significant amount of muscle just by being less physically active. And so I feel like our generation in particular is kind of rewriting the narrative, is also making women much more aware of what are the things we can do now to avoid frailty. And for those listeners that are not familiarized with why frailty is such a huge issue, is that frailty and muscle loss leads to falls. And falls can lead to head bleeds. If you hit your head hard enough, that's what my dad died from, or frailty can lead to broken hips. And we know that that's a poor it's a poor indicator of morbidity and mortality. And if you look at the statistics, a fractured hip, you're more likely to die within a year. That doesn't mean that's the case for everyone. I have a mother-in-law who is tough as nails. She broke her hip a couple years ago and then fell or broke her femur last year. And she's still, feisty as ever. But now she's dealing with using a walker to ambulate. So again, I think that our generation is just making women much more aware proactively of the things that they can be doing to avoid ending up in a nursing home, ending up breaking a hip and falling, just being aware of the role of nutrition and why protein is so critically important. And then, you could toss in there, the value of sleep. My mother used to tell me I'll sleep when I'm dead. She was the CIO of some big medical systems, University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine, Case Western, Henry Ford, big medical systems. She was completely stressed out all those years she had those jobs. And so I'd say to her all the time, you retired and you lost 20 pounds because she didn't have that chronic stress.
Mhm.
So I feel like our generation is doing a really good job of just making women more aware. And probably for like my nieces who are, all of them in their teens, they're going to navigate their 20s and 30s in a much more informed manner and making better decisions than any of us did because no one was talking about the aging process. And
Mhm.
sure as heck, I went back and looked at one of my medical school texts, and there was like 2 lines on menopause. Like there was no discussion on perimenopause and absolutely not enough information on menopause. It's like menopause, you fall off a cliff, you die. Like that's just kind
Mhm.
of the context of the information. It was very cursory, and there was no emphasis on how women's bodies change as they're navigating, the second half of their lives.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me that, you're speaking of your family and how our parents age. And I keep paying attention to most friends, even yesterday, I talked to two people that their fathers, the men, pass away often
Mhm.
first before the women. And do you have any thoughts on that? Why the women seem to outlive the men and that
Yeah.
men should focus on their health too?
Yeah, well, yes. And so it's interesting. I think if you look at the statistics, men generally do predecease their partners. That is correct. I do think it's a combination of lifestyle and then, the big morbidity and mortality indicators. It's heart disease, it's stroke, it's cancer risks. What's interesting about women is they talk about this marginal decade. So we live longer, but we don't have a good quality of life. And for me, there is nothing more horrific than imagining being in my 80s and I am incontinent. I fall. I can't
Mhm.
ambulate. I'm dependent on someone else to cook my meals and to help facilitate things. If you look statistically, the number one cause of death for women in menopause is heart disease. So there's a lot of focus, appropriately so, on cancer screenings, and I think that's important. But lifestyle measures are critically important. Talking about the role of hormone replacement therapy as being an adjunct to reducing our risk of heart disease issues is important. I think it's 1 in 3 women will die of heart disease. So it really is a huge problem. And estrogen protects us until we go into menopause. We know that it has potent anti inflammatory benefits, it regulates the immune function, regulates inflammation throughout the body and oxidative stress. But when I think about the key differentiators between men and women, the important thing to indicate is that women lead this marginal decade. So you may live into your 80s, but the last 10 years of your life, the quality of life metrics are really poor for the average person. And I think a great deal of that has to do with the fact that there's really poor metabolic health, really at the basis of what's driving more cancer risks, more whether it's peripheral vascular disease, cardiovascular disease, cerebral vascular disease, kind of diffusely. We used to call them vascular paths. For your listeners, I worked 16 years in clinical cardiology, and prior to that, I was an ER nurse. So I'm a retired adrenaline junkie. But one of the things that I think is really important is maintaining metabolic health, and metabolic health is so intricately tied into lifestyle measures. The physical activity, the nutrition piece. Unfortunately, it's not sexy to say, hey, I really want you to get 7 or 8 hours a night of sleep, good quality sleep. I don't want you waking up multiple times a night to pee. That's not a good indication. For men, it can be from an enlarged prostate. For women, it could be the loss of estrogen in the genitourinary system. And everyone listening should be having a conversation about vaginal estrogen if you're in menopause, because it's not a question of if, but when, and why that's important. It's not just waking up at night to pee, which is a pain and it's disruptive. It has a lot to do with your future risk of developing urinary tract infections. And the issue with urinary tract infections, all of us think, oh, it's a nuisance, it's a pain, I just get an oral antibiotic. You might be in a position where you may have no symptoms and you can actually get a blood infection called sepsis. And
Mhm.
urosepsis is no joke. I saw a lot of women in the ICU. Sometimes they die because of urosepsis. So it's something that's preventable by something as simple as vaginal estrogen. So when
Mhm.
I think about the things that make a big difference for women navigating middle age, it goes back to those foundational basics. You got to talk about nutrition. You need more protein. And if you think that I'm kidding, I encourage you to download an app like Chronometer, which is free. I have no affiliation with them. Track your protein for a week. I can pretty much guarantee you're not eating enough, not enough to maintain muscle, and certainly not enough to trigger muscle protein synthesis. Like I think about the women that will tell me they'll give me a food diary and I read through it and I'm like, listen, give me the good, bad, and ugly. Don't not share something because you feel embarrassed. I mean, there is no judgment. And women are eating like 50 grams of protein a day. And I'm like, ladies, that's not enough to maintain muscle. Not to mention, you're not strength training. So you're really this acceleration. I think it's 8% per decade. I mean, it really accelerates in menopause. And so with that loss of muscle, we lose insulin sensitivity. Why is that so important? Has a lot to do with maintaining this metabolic sync. Actually, our
Mhm.
muscles have these GLUT4 transporters that help us scavenge up our blood sugar. So I tell people, like, take a walk after dinner, take a 15-minute walk. Almost everyone can do that. You don't need any special equipment other than please wear shoes because that will make a big difference. Just walk after a meal, walk after 3 meals a day. You could, add up to 30 minutes of walking every day just by doing that. The other thing is the processed carbohydrates. We are a nation that largely likes processed foods. We know statistically that if you are consuming the bulk of your diet with processed foods, guess what? You're consuming anywhere from 500 to 1,000 or more additional calories a day. And you start talking about middle aged women, they can't eat like they did when they were in college or when they were 18 or 25 or 30. And I know for a lot of us that's upsetting. But the realization is we have to change our relationship with food. We
Mhm.
have to fuel our body with real food. Like, I don't want people to be afraid of eating a potato or eating a sweet potato or eating a bowl of berries. And I think we've gotten too far the other extreme. Like, carbs have been vilified. I eat a lot more carbs on the days I lift heavy. And so I think it's helping people understand more protein, watch the processed stuff. If you have a kryptonite, don't keep it in the house. Like, I love a gluten-free brownie. Well, I've learned I cannot make a pan of gluten-free brownies. It's like kryptonite. So what do I
Uh-huh.
do? It drives my husband crazy, but I'll make it. I'll have my serving and then I'll throw it in the trash. And he's like, "What are you doing?" And I'm like, "You can moderate, I cannot." So for me, it's
Yeah.
like a no-brainer. But I think for each one of us, if there's something that is your kryptonite, just find a healthier alternative or just don't keep it in your house. And I would say
Mhm.
the other thing is, the sleep, learning how to lift heavy, because a lot of people think they can just do Pilates or body weight. And I'm not suggesting Pilates isn't wonderful. I mean, I actually really enjoy Pilates, but that is not what helps me build muscle personally. And I am someone that has done Pilates intermittently for like 5 to 10 years. And I love it just for the challenge of it. Like I look at my puppy I was telling you about, who is very smart and needs a challenge. Otherwise, he gets mischievous. And so for me, I like Pilates because I like to see what I can force my body to do. But that's not what helps me build and maintain lean muscle mass. And so I think for each one of us, it's the prioritization of taking care of ourselves that really makes a big difference. And then we have to have a conversation about hormone replacement therapy, which I think for many people, they're still going to providers who vilify it. And if your provider is vilifying hormone replacement therapy, we just need to find you a new provider because you need to at least be informed about your options. And if you choose not to take HRT, that is a choice. And I will respect that. But I will make sure that my patient understands the pros, the cons, the benefits, et cetera. And, one thing that I hear in some of the groups that you and I are both in, Debbie, well, if God intended us to live this long, then hormones are optional. And I'm like, no, God did not intend us to live. It is because of medical technology, sanitation, better food quality. That is why we are living longer. I don't think God intended us to live without hormones, because hormones make such a big difference. When
Mhm.
I'm looking at an intake form for a patient or client, I can tell who's on HRT because they generally are able to maintain a healthy weight. They feel like they're sharp cognitively. They sleep really well. Like, sleep is huge with hormones. So I think that aging is inevitable, right? Suffering is not. So I always say, like, if you're struggling in some capacity, there's probably a lifestyle measure that can be improved upon. And the conversation around hormone replacement therapy really does need to happen, because you need to be truly informed. Just like, Debbie, I'm sure we're of the generation where we were all put on oral contraceptives because we always had wonky periods. And as I was getting into the research for my new book, the realization of the net impact of starting teenagers on Depo-Provera and oral contraceptives, the impact on bone building capacity is so significant that I say to people now, like, listen, I'm all for, like, women having options. If you need contraception, find the best option for you, but make sure your provider's talking to you about the potential side effects. Like, Depo-Provera will impact bone mass quite significantly, as does oral contraceptives. And teenagers are particularly vulnerable at
Mhm.
that time in their life, because we know peak bone and muscle mass is really in your late teens to 20s, and kind of peaks in your 30, early, probably ideally at 30 years old. So if you're kept in a low hormone state for a long period of time, guess what?
Mm.
You're
Yeah.
probably going to be dealing with bone mass issues as you get older.
Huh. So going back, just to summarize, I like to break it up more, the holistic, looking at nutrition, exercise, sleep, stress, movement. And I always love to go in hydration, mineral balancing, and the happiness,
Yes.
gratitude, or what I break up as the 8 elements. But the nutrition, as we age, you mentioned, being insulin sensitive. So really that goes with exercise. So you're just talking about the strength training help more, that larger suitcase theory. I was like, just get more clothes in that suitcase, along with the protein. So prioritizing protein. And what you said also, I think, is huge. What's happened the last 5 years or more, maybe 5 years, that we went from super low carb, everything, all carbs are bad, even nature's carbs, to all fat. We forgot about protein. So now we've swung back going, okay, we need protein. And I think, Dr. Gabrielle Lyons started speaking about that 5 years ago and started to make everyone realize, hey, we can't just do only fat. You need a little bit of both, and you need nature's carbohydrates for fueling for the right type of exercise and microbiome, some people would say, as well as other purposes. But what anything else with nutrition you feel that we can touch on before, I guess, nutrition and exercise together, how we need changes as we age?
Yeah, I mean, I would say you're right about the protein, and there's something actually called the protein leverage hypothesis. And it basically states that in a state of, so let's talk about some hormones. There's follicular stimulating hormone and there's estrogen. Follicular stimulating hormone, secreted by the pituitary gland, tells the ovaries to release an egg. But as we're getting older, our eggs are as old as we are. So there's a finite amount of eggs. And as we get closer to menopause, FSH starts to rise because the brain is shouting at the ovaries, release an egg, and it's saying, no, I'm getting ready to go on permanent vacation. And our estrogen levels are starting to decline. So, in this setting of high FSH, low estrogen, estradiol is the predominant form of estrogen in our bodies prior to menopause. This protein leverage hypothesis becomes a bigger issue. And it effectively, what it states is, if you are not eating enough protein, your body will make sure you're getting enough calories in. So I'm going to say this again. We know that as we age, we need a minimum of 30 grams of protein per meal to stimulate muscle protein synthesis, which is that threshold to start building muscle and maintaining muscle. I would argue it really needs to be about 50.
Mm.
I frankly feel
Yeah.
like it should be 50. That's what I aim for. And so if you're hitting those protein thresholds, you're going to be more satiated. You're probably going to have an easier time building muscle, et cetera, et cetera. And what's interesting is I will say to women when they give me a food diary and they're eating 50 grams a day, they're like, oh, why am I so hungry at night? And it's their body's way of figuring out, like, if you're going to need more calories, we are going to stimulate you to eat at nighttime, probably
Mm.
not the right fats, not the right carbohydrates to hit that threshold. And then that satiety metric is met. So, number one, protein, protein, protein is very important. The carbohydrate piece, I agree with you. Carbs have been bastardized for 5, 10 years. And there are people who are carb addicted. And let me be clear, but that is a
Yeah.
very small percentage of the population. And for such a long time, we have bastardized carbohydrates. People are afraid to eat a piece of fruit. People are petrified to eat a salad. And I'm like, no, 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 no. Those are healthy types of carbohydrates. Now, if you're someone that is a carb addict and a sugar addict, then you probably need to be more conscientious about the vegetables and lower carbohydrate options, which I'm sure your community is very savvy about. And I usually will say 3 vegetables to 1 piece of fruit so that people get their vegetables in. And if you're insulin resistant, then you probably need to be even more conscientious. But for purposes of this conversation, that 3-to-1 ratio seems to work really well. And just having finished a book talking about the gut microbiome, I do think fruits and vegetables are important. I do think fiber is very important because it feeds the microbes in the gut microbiome and they don't get fed by eating just protein. And so that means lentils and it means different types of fruits and vegetables. It means, resistant starches. They're for some people they do better with, cooked cooled potato, cooked cooled white rice. And yes, I'm saying rice like people are going to scream like, "Oh my gosh, rice." Yes, but we're talking about small
Yeah.
portions. This whole concept of portion distortion, which I think for a lot of women, like they've been so like I have teenage boys, they can eat 2 cups of rice and it's like nothing. If I'm going to have a grain or if I'm going to have lentils, it's a quarter cup, half a cup, a third of a cup. I mean, it's a small portion. I don't need a lot, but that is very important information. The other thing is when we talk about ketogenic diets, because you were mentioning the ketogenic diets, tend to be higher fat, tend to be moderate protein. When I have women tell me, oh, I started a ketogenic diet, other than the people that say I had half a stick of butter and 5 avocados and they can't figure out why they're gaining weight, it's a reflection of the gut microbiome. If a ketogenic diet does not work for you, it is largely a byproduct of the composition of your gut bugs, so viruses, bacteria that are in the gut. Because if your bacteria is not optimized, you are not going to break down and assimilate those nutrients, and in many instances, it can lead to weight gain. So, let me be really clear. This is why trial and error is so important. This is why bioindividuality is so important. And again, if you look at the research looking at what exercise influences the gut microbiome, it runs the gamut. But, too intense exercise, like let's say you're doing an Ironman every month, like just as an example, that's a pretty intense form of exercise. You will get a degree of leaky gut relevant to how intense the physical activity is. And so we're just at greater risk as we're navigating perimenopause and menopause to develop leaky gut. That is a byproduct of estrogen, that loss of estrogen. It's like the gatekeeper in that small intestinal lining. And so just reminding people that the intensity of exercise, I'm not saying don't exercise, but we have to find the right intensity for ourselves that doesn't overtax the body, but still challenges it. And so I think that's where, the rubber hits the road. Again, it goes back to strength training, zone 2 training, flexibility work. If you're doing, box training or box jumps, or burst training or high intensity interval training, which is not 30 minutes of hit. Someone will say, I'm going to take a hit class. I'm like, no,
Yeah.
it
No.
is short duration. It really, like when I do that with my trainer, we are done in 10 minutes, totally. Like, and it's not what most people think high intensity interval training is. So, with that being said, it's the right types of exercise, the right types of nutrition, and that may take some fine tuning. Like, I have some people that do really well on higher fat meat. I have some people that do better on leaner meat, and it may take a little bit of trial and error. And the people that I oftentimes see that are not doing well on like high fat, like they're the ribeye, the duck, um, salmon, those are generally the people that probably are over. We use the term over absorbers of cholesterol. And so sometimes their body just does a really pristine job of over absorbing. I'm one of these people. And I've always done better with leaner meat. And when I figured that out, I was like, that makes so much sense. So for each one of us, there may be a little bit of fine tuning to find what works best for us. And what works best for Debbie may not work best for me. But there are some kind of, high level concepts that apply to everyone, but it's, the nuance of when we're working with people. I know when you're working with people is figuring out what are the levers that are most important for them to get them back to a state of health that they're trying to attain.
Do you ever look at genetics in that when you're working with
Sometimes I
people?
do. I mean, I think that I think there's a couple things. There are certain colleagues of mine that are particularly good. Like that's all they do is the
Mm.
genetics piece. That's usually who I'll refer them to because I know the basics. I know enough to be able to navigate a genetic mapping report. I have 2 copies of MTHFR, but I tell everyone, so do a lot of other people. That doesn't per se mean that you have to take special vitamins. Not everyone needs them. I don't. But I think that for a lot of people, the genetics piece can be very helpful, but it also needs to be in the context of working with someone that is very good at what they do because I see a lot of people that throw out, it's like alphabet soup. This is the COMT gene, this is MTHFR, and they understand a little bit just enough to be dangerous. So, always in the context, if this is your jam and you're really, really into this, like make sure you're working with someone that has looked at hundreds and hundreds of tests and feels very comfortable because genetics can be an alphabet soup. And it always in the context of that particular intervention or that particular individual with any type of testing. I usually will say, a lot of the integrative medicine tests are expensive. And I'll tell people if you're not doing this testing with us, that's fine. But make sure the person that's reading your Dutch report, as an example, that has looked at hundreds, if not thousands of them, because it is a complicated test. And I see a lot of functional medicine providers, even licensed providers that order
Yeah.
these tests. And patients will come into programs with us and we're looking at, well, like, well, what did the physician tell you to do? And they're like, well, not really a whole lot. And then sometimes we have people consult with us to interpret the test for their
Mm.
patients. And I'm like, listen, just make sure that if you are having a test done by a provider or practitioner, that there's going to be information that's necessary or it's going to be beneficial for you, as opposed to, I still think there's just a lot of people who order a lot of tests and they're not judicious in what they're doing, and it can get quite expensive.
Yes. Lab testing is very expensive. Yes, we can run 3 to 5 labs, but ideally the prices would be lower. We can do them quarterly, but
Yes. Yeah.
but the
Unfortunately, not.
I know. It's just I'd love a stool test every, maybe 6 months, twice a year, be able to do that. And then the Dutch test and
Mhm.
the DNA company, I know you did a test with them on your show, and I did one last year, 2 years ago. And I always find that question is you're speaking of saturated fat and how you don't do well. And I'm similar. That's why I was thinking you're my sister from other parents because I'm like, that's me too.
Yeah.
And that how I don't digest as well heavy fat. And then you listen to the research that came out on saturated fat and the Feldman, those guys, the new study results came out this 2 days
About
ago, and just
ApoB. Yeah.
yeah, APOB and hyper responders. And I always get confused, like, all right, well, what if you are not you're more sensitive to saturated fat, but then there's people that just say, hey, saturated fat's not bad for you, it's good for you, and it doesn't impact heart disease. But then you look at genetics, then those genetic reports will say you should limit your saturated fat, even its ancestral health source of fat, that it's different for everybody how you
Yeah,
respond.
absolutely. And this is a really great example of the fact that because I'm a hyper absorber, which I know I am, it explains my body soaks it up like a sponge. So I don't make a habit of having coconut oil, even though it's a completely healthy type of fat. I do better with olive oil. I do better with
Mm-hmm.
avocado oil.
Yeah.
And I somehow had kind of figured that out on my own, but it was very validating. It's interesting. I was just on Dave's podcast, Dave Feldman's podcast in January. And I've had Nick and Dave on the podcast a couple times, and their most recent research was talking about lean mass hyperresponders and apolipoprotein B, which is kind of the darling of the lipid community right now. And
Mm-hmm.
so, my one thing that I would say is someone who almost did a lipid fellowship because I was such a nerd about lipids, and I'm so grateful I didn't because it's very, very dense. It's just a very dense topic. I think that it really speaks to the fact that we are just now starting to understand the way these lipid molecules really work in the body. For a long time, LDL was, we were told LDL is terrible. I've always had a high LDL. I've always had a high total cholesterol. And for years, I had physicians who were telling me I needed to be on a statin, and I knew enough to say no. But the important thing that I want to make sure I convey to the audience is that there's there's an appropriate time to have a conversation about a statin or any medication. But I, as a woman, I would not want to be on a statin because there's a study that came out, and this is not medical advice. This is just my clinical opinion. There was a study that came out in 2016 called the Jupiter study. If you are a woman and someone is talking to you about going on a statin, please pull that study and have a conversation with your clinician because basically women are at higher risk of developing insulin resistance and diabetes if they're placed on a statin, and that it's quite significant. It's substantially significant. It's so significant, in fact, that when that study came out, I was still practicing for this large cardiology group. And we had to have a meeting with the providers to talk about how are we going to address this study because the results are troubling, and we have patients that have documented heart disease. So again, this is a clinical indication for a statin based on evidence-based medicine. But for people that don't fall into the currently diabetic, heart disease, vascular disease, et cetera, how it demonstrates it's not helpful for primary prevention. So this is a huge kind of blow to kind of the conventional allopathic model that was encouraging patients to go on statins for just about everything you can imagine. And it's still happening because we get questions in a free group that we have on Facebook. And more often than not, it's questions like these, like, oh, my LDL is 175. My doctor wants to put me on a statin. And I always say this is not medical advice. However, I would pull this study, have a conversation with your provider because there's a lot of side effects, potential side effects. My mom was on a statin. My dad was on a statin. My mom went off after we had this conversation, and my dad steadfastly continued. And I think it had a lot to do with his neurocognitive decline because the thing about statins that many people may not realize, the brain itself has its own source of cholesterol, different from the peripheral part of our bodies. There are some new novel, when I say new, that's equivalent, new novel statins that are supposed to not cross the blood-brain barrier. But I have good advice from probably the leading lipidologist in the world, if not the United States. He said they all cross the blood-brain barrier. So to somehow think that there isn't going to be some negative impact on neurocognition, I'm just not willing to take that chance. So
Mhm.
managed to get my mom off, not my dad, but I do think it contributed to some of the health issues that we saw towards the end of his life.
Yes, I've been shifting my focus to cognitive health lately because of all these stories of Alzheimer's, dementia, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and really going down deep rabbit holes. Okay, yeah, what can we do now in midlife to prevent what we see happening so often to our parents' age and their friends and community? Is just awful
Yeah.
to, as you said, the quality of life, and we want to live a longer life, but it is being quality. And that's what I keep laughing to saying, I want to be in my prime when I'm 80 and
Yeah.
go
You will be.
Croatia, just
Yeah, you
do
will be.
everything, traveling. That I just like that cognitive, just to have Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, dementia just seems almost the worst way to go.
Yeah.
And
Well,
just to
and it's
struggle.
interesting. I just interviewed Dr. Heather Sandison. So she's a naturopathic doctor, trained with Dr. Bredesen, and she wrote a whole book, a New York Times bestselling book talking about Alzheimer's. And so I interviewed her yesterday because we had to keep rescheduling because of my husband's healthcare hiccups. And so when we had this conversation, the one thing I was saying to her was I think many women in their 40s and 50s don't realize that our brains in our 60s, 70s, and 80s are made at this stage of life. So it's really the time to dial in on all these lifestyle measures. There's so much that's preventative. And that's the biggest thing is that most of the almost every single Alzheimer's drug that's out there doesn't improve cognition. It's been very myopic, the whole Alzheimer's research. And there's a book called Doctored. I'm looking at my
And doctored.
this was actually doctored by Charles Pillar. He's coming
Mm.
on the podcast in May. He's an investigative journalist, but he's talking about how this whole paradigm around Alzheimer's research has been It's doctored research. It's research that actually is not looking at the primary root cause of why we're seeing escalating rates of
Mm-hmm.
neurocognitive disease. And so, like that book, as soon as it was published, I bought it and I was like, I need to interview this guy. But I think for so many of us, it's understanding that a lot of the Alzheimer's research that's been done is not demonstrating good clinical efficacy. It's not improving neurocognition, which is why the lifestyle measures are so critically important. And even
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Sanderson was talking about the things that we're talking about, intermittent fasting. She likes a ketogenic diet because of ketosis and
Mm-hmm.
BDNF, brain derived neurotrophic factor. But she talks a lot about, when we look at these paradigms, you talk about paradigms, I talk about paradigms. It's really this lifestyle paradigm that is more likely to help maintain our brain health, our acuity, memory, recall. She was identifying things to look for because that's always the question my people ask me, what are the signs that your, neurocognitive status is changing? I'm like, that's a terrifying concept. I never want to be a burden to my family. And I jokingly said to my husband, I was like, I think because he's talked about doing a PhD in economics. I said, I think I want you to start doing that now because it's so important to continue stimulating our brains, like having a podcast, being a voluminous reader, speaking on stages. Like all these things are so important to always be learning because we want to be stimulating, new connections in our brains and to always be learning. Unfortunately, there are a lot of people that they finish high school or they finish college and they're like, done, never need to learn
Mm-hmm.
anything ever again. That's actually a problem for a lot of people as they get out of the habit of learning and they, come home at night and they sit in front of the TV instead of, maybe engaging in a puzzle, like doing something to
Mm-hmm.
stimulate your brain.
Brain.
I
Mm-hmm.
say all the time, I'll be podcasting till I die because I love reading, I love learning, as I know you do as well. And so when we express those concerns about wanting to limit our ability to, be impacted by changes in cognition, it starts now. Like in your 40s and 50s, it's the time to get serious about lifestyle because it does have a huge role to play in the trajectory of how we age.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I'm laughing. My husband wants to retire at 60 years old and live in Europe part time.
Oh, it sounds
Because
amazing.
because I was looking at Portugal or Mallorca or
Yep.
somewhere in Spain, and so as I was looking at where to live part time, but he always laughs at, well, you'll probably still be working and podcasting till forever.
I can do that from anywhere.
You can do that anywhere, exactly. I will add to you that I got down, Parkinson's research on the why after talking to Martha Carlin, and her husband passed away from Parkinson's, done a lot of research and doing work for BioQuest, their company on microbiome. And then Dr. William Davis always refers to Martha. And so I've been podcasting with them, and Beam Minerals, we're going to do a group. I have to figure out how to navigate interviewing three people at once, but we're going to do a cognitive health
Oh, smart.
podcast next week and talking about the glycolics layer and how that's impacting the Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, dementia, and just cognitive health in general. But it's pretty amazing, as you're saying, to work backwards, looking at the root causes. And I always go to the vagus nerve, and we're talking about, stomach, H. pylori, and all this stuff that it's like, how does it end up having cognitive decline? So, anyways, focusing on your midlife pause, I know everyone will probably want more information on hormone replacement, as that's just a hot topic right now. And as we talk about different areas of holistic health, looking at the nutrition, exercise, sleep, and stress, and you've talked about estrogen, talk a little bit more how, like, the main reasons people might want to talk to their provider for it, at
Yeah, well,
what age
it's
too.
yeah, so there was something called the Women's Health Initiative that came out in 2002. It's important to kind of have context. And so I was a new nurse practitioner in 2000. Yes, I've been an NP that long. It's hard to believe.
No.
But it really changed the landscape. Up until that point, HRT was prescribed with regularity. My mother's entire generation, well, my mother and her sisters were all taking it. And in one fell swoop, the study was not properly interpreted. It was actually done on older, sicker population of women. They use synthetic hormones, not bioidenticals. And so in a fall swoop, you have an entire generation of clinicians fearful to prescribe, and you have an entire generation of women fearful to take hormones. And actually, the research definitely suggests there are profound benefits, not just brain, bone, and heart, but healthy neurotransmitters, gut microbiome. Remember, I mentioned that estrogen really is involved in the integrity of
Hmm.
the immune system, which
Okay.
goes completely haywire and south in perimenopause to menopause. I've got a whole
Okay.
story around that, but I'll save that for another day. But helping women understand that it's not just estrogen. Estrogen and progesterone are critically important. Even if you no
Mhm.
longer have a uterus, women will say, "Oh, I had a partial hysterectomy." You still have progesterone receptors diffusely across your brain, your bones, your heart, everywhere. Same thing with testosterone. Not every woman needs testosterone replacement. And I think it's important to kind of explain that progesterone is really the first significant hormonal decline that we see in early perimenopause. Our ovaries are as old as we are. There's something called ovarian senescence, which is a fancy way of saying our ovaries set the pacemaker of aging in women. Fun fact, a lot of people don't realize that. And so, as our ovaries are producing less progesterone, that begins the sequelae of insomnia, anxiety, depression. A lot of women just experience that right before their menstrual cycle. Then that may continue throughout the cycle. A lot of the women are prescribed antidepressants, anti anxiety agents.
Mhm.
Estrogen fluctuates 20 to 30% more at higher in that stage of life in perimenopause than at any other time in our lives. That explains a lot of the wild symptoms of perimenopause, the very heavy cycles, the breast enlargement or breast pain, weight loss resistance, the mood issues that we can see, bloating, in some instances, diarrhea, constipation, all these gut disturbances that occur. And then towards the end of perimenopause, we have low progesterone, low estrogen. Women might start seeing vasomotor symptoms, night sweats, which are not fun at all. I didn't have my first night sweat or actually a vasomotor symptom in general until it was the middle of the summer, is 2018. And my cousin's an OBGYN. I actually texted her. I was like, I think I just had a hot flash. But it took me by complete surprise. I mean, at that point, I was 47. I was stunned. Like, I was like, literally, like, oh my God, what just happened to me? And we're just not preparing women for these conversations. And so, as we transition into menopause, 12 years out of menstrual cycle, about 25% of women don't need testosterone replacement. But testosterone is the most potent hormone in a woman's body, and we make about a tenth of what a man does. But it is very important for it. Everyone thinks just about libido. It's important for muscle development, executive function. It's the get off the couch and get your butt to the gym. It's the thing that helps you to stay focused and confident and is so important. And so, not every woman needs testosterone, but more often than not, it's better to start HRT when we are in perimenopause than to
Mhm.
wait until menopause. Does that mean you've completely missed the boat if you're 5 or 10 years into menopause? Absolutely not. You need to have informed consent with your provider and finding the right provider to help navigate your choices. I have an estrogen patch. I use vaginal estrogen. I take oral progesterone. I also use transdermal testosterone. There's no FDA approved testosterone for women yet. So most of it is compounded very inexpensively. But you can take bioidentical hormones in a very economical way. I think there's this misconception that everyone needs compounded hormones. I do just fine on my very inexpensive estrogen patch. I do really well on compounded progesterone because I like the immediate and sustained release because it keeps me sleep better. I have tried the other variety, but oral micronized progesterone can be gotten very inexpensively. Testosterone compounded, not too bad. Some people are using things like androgel, which is the type of transdermal testosterone that men can use, but it gets a little tricky trying to dose it because women take 1/10 of the dose, and you get this
Oh,
little packet. And you're supposed to squeeze 10 doses out of it. And I'm like, sometimes that can be a little bit daunting. So I think for each one of us, other than that, other hormones, like some people need DHEA, pregnenolone is very important. DHEA and pregnenolone can also be compounded, or you can find it in supplement form over the counter. Pregnenolone is very important for memory. Little fun tidbit here, a little pearl. You want your pregnenolone to be checked and you want it to be greater than 50 milligrams per deciliter. It's very important for maintaining memory. I check mine probably 4 times a year. It's always the thing I say to my provider, make sure you check my pregnenolone because it's important. That is also actively involved in memory consolidation. And I want to remain cognitively sharp till the bitter end. So those
yeah.
are the things I think about. But it's not too early to start oral progesterone or even transdermal progesterone if you're a woman in perimenopause. If you're in menopause, oral progesterone is the only formulation that's been determined to be protective to the uterus, and that's the one that's most well researched. But sometimes women in perimenopause just benefit from transdermal, which is skin absorbed progesterone. Just make sure you get a clean source. There's a lot of crazy. Make sure you read the labels. When it comes to vaginal estrogen, I always get this question. The cheap stuff that you can get very inexpensively at the pharmacy has a bunch of parabens in it. Our vaginal walls are very, very vascular. And so I always say if your budget permits, make sure you get compounded stuff so you avoid the parabens. Unfortunately, the regular inexpensive stuff that your physician, nurse practitioner, PA can write for still has all the yucky endocrine mimicking chemicals in it. And that's a part of your body you don't want to be putting
Mm.
those chemicals in. I've had women say, can you use vaginal estrogen on your face? Yes, you can. Although there's a provider out there, Dr. Jen Gunter, who I don't know if you know Dr. Jen.
Mm-mm.
She is. I actually follow her stuff as well because she's very contrarian and she's not afraid to like create controversy. But she talks about the fact that, now you've got all these women that have got vaginal estrogen, then they're using vaginal estrogen on their face and they've got patches. It's just, estrogen overload. So, don't use that without having a conversation with your provider. But we know that as we are losing estrogen in our bodies, collagen and elastin are impacted. So that wrinkling piece. And so for some people, they like having the additional putting estrogen on their faces. I don't personally do that. I use other things, but that is certainly an option for some people.
I just was laughing, thinking, where did I hear that or see that? It was Emily in Paris last season. I don't know if you ever
Yep.
watched that. And so they
Yes.
put the
I.
marketing gimmick of the vaginal cream on their
Yep.
face. It was
Yeah.
glowing.
I watch Emily in Paris just for the fashion because I
Me
love to
too.
see the crazy outfits. I'm like, wow. Like I
I
think
know.
that's awesome that you're bold enough to wear that. But wow.
Yeah, I know. That's why I watched them for the fashion. So, where do people find someone that can figure out the hormones? Because it is metabolic harmony to figure out the right amount and that your liver isn't congested and you're
Yep.
getting rid of excess hormones. So, where can people find someone that's actually up to date on
Yeah.
this research?
So we have a guide, and some of these people we personally know. Some people are just acquaintances, providers across the United States. You're more than welcome to message my team at support@cynthiathurlow.com. We'll share that resource with your community. Beyond that, sometimes people live in states where we just don't have connections. There are companies like MIDI Health, MIDI Health. I interviewed Dr. Kathleen Jordan on the podcast, and they're lovely. What I have heard, they have both physicians and nurse practitioners throughout the US. But what I've heard, this is just a dovetail caveat, not everyone prescribes testosterone. So
Mm.
if you're looking for testosterone, it gets a little more complicated. And let me be clear, testosterone transdermally is great. I'm not a fan of pellets because most people that are doing pellets are giving whopping doses of hormones, and women are stuck with whatever they've got for 3 months. I'm also not a huge fan of subcutaneous testosterone. I think you get a rapid peak and trough. So it means you get a high level and then it drops off till you get your next dose, and the trough is the low level. MIDI Health can be a nice option. I have no affiliation with them, but for people that need telemedicine, that are in a state where they don't have local options. But, a compounding pharmacy sometimes can be a helpful resource. If you have a local compounding pharmacy, you can ask them like which providers do they think are doing a really great job. That's another option. Although, as I stated before, there's plenty of, estrogen patches and progesterone that you can get at your regular pharmacy, but compounding pharmacies can be another resource as well.
Mm. Yeah, I think that it's always hard to find someone that understands all of this and gets
That
it
is that
limited.
is the challenge because there are people that are like really good at one thing, and sometimes it's not all the things. And it's interesting because I've done a lot of trainings in hormones, and I'm part of a group where like Heather Hirsch, Kelly Casperson, like Vonda Wright are in this group, and so I get to kind of see the way that they answer and respond to things. And I think most providers are really conservative, and so sometimes you have women who still have symptoms, and they're being told, well, this is too high. But it's all about finding what is the right dose for the right patient. And so this is why I encourage people to, if you don't find the right person on the right go around, that's okay. you'll get them on the next go around. And you don't have to suffer. Like suffering is optional. We want to thrive and not just survive. And I'm so glad, like I've had, we could have a whole podcast about some of the wild things that I've dealt with different providers personally as a clinician myself. Like I don't prescribe my hormones. I let another clinician do that. Some of the wild things that I have experienced personally as a menopausal female on HRT with other providers, just wild things. So I'm like, I'm well like versed and I understand, I understand the physiology and all the semantics. The average person may not. And therefore it just goes to show you, even people that are seasoned clinicians can get hoodwinked by some of these people out there. Thankfully, hopefully they're the minority. But there are definitely some people out there that you just kind of shake your head and you're like, I don't know how you sleep at night. Like truly.
Sad. So perimenopause symptoms can start, say, 12 years, 10
Yeah,
years
you could start in
before.
late 30s. A lot of women, it's early 30s. And if a woman has PCOS, you're already low on progesterone to begin with. You may start even earlier. So I tell every woman, I was probably 37 when I started noticing that I was starting to get symptoms, but I didn't fully understand what was happening because, again, there was little discussion, probably in my early 40s, that I really was like, whoa, something is definitely different here. So,
Mhm.
yeah, 10 to 15 years prior to menopause. Average age here in the United States is 51. So, for a lot of women, they're in their 30s when it's starting. And I laugh because most of my team are in their 30s. And I tell them all the time, like, I hope I don't make you fearful of perimenopause. Like, I hope I don't make you scared. They're like, no, I feel super informed. I know what to look for. I know how to advocate for myself. So,
I think it's getting all the tools now so you can navigate through midlife and not have any of these symptoms. I mean, I'm 53 somehow,
yep,
same age as you, and
yep,
54 this November. That's like, wait, what? I'm having,
yeah, yeah.
I am not there yet. And but so I'm going to be a late bloomer, I guess, going to the
And
next
that's
phase.
okay. I mean, and
Yeah.
that's okay. It's interesting. Some of the things I talk about in my new book is adverse childhood events and how that can influence going to menopause earlier. Like
Mm,
early childhood trauma can impact
mm,
when you go into menopause. And that's a
mm,
whole, like, there's a whole chapter devoted to that. It's really, really
mm.
interesting. So I think for some people, you take good care of yourself. I did too, but my genetics were probably working against me. But I think for a lot of people, if they're not yet menopausal, one thing that Dr. Felice Gersh talks about is that most women who are like 53, 54, they're not, it's all dysfunctional uterine bleeding. Like she's like, listen, you're not ovulating anymore. It's just, your ovaries haven't, they're kind of like squeaking over the finish line. They're just not done yet. But
Yeah, they're confused what to
yes,
do. So we have a new book coming out next year, April.
2026.
Yeah. And then you launched a new program. I know what's our time, but do you want to just give a little overview of what you're working on if you have a few minutes to
Yeah, yeah.
finish?
So, yeah, new supplement line called the Midlife Pause. We have Creatine Plus, and four other supplements. We have two other supplements coming out this summer, which we just finalized, which is really exciting. And it's a flagship product doing the best form of creatine monohydrate on the market called Crea Pure, most absorbable. And I mean, there's just been a tremendous response where the line is doing really well. As far as I know, it's one of the very first lines that's really devoted, research based for women in middle age and beyond. There's no gimmicks. And, it's vitamin D. There's a collagen product. There's a fiber product, which we all need. There's some adaptogenic mushrooms because everyone needs some degree of stress support. And we've been delighted and excited to see how well received it's been.
Yeah, I've told you I love the creatine plus, and I've been doing it in the morning pre-workout, and it really it's nice tasting and
Hmm.
not. I take supplements slowly when I'm trying something new because I get headaches super easily. And I realize it's a different type of sweeteners. So there's different stevias that I really react to, like Element. I can't do Element stevia. So I have to be careful on it. I didn't have problems with this,
Oh,
fortunately, because I
good.
always need more creatine and working on muscle and brain health part of it. And then the B vitamins in there, I'm
Yep.
always showing when I do my lab assessments that it's always needing more.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
more is not better, but
absolutely.
it's the right dose
Absolutely.
for it.
And then it has alpha GPC, which is a nootropic. And so that can
Mhm.
be, really, really helpful and nice. And so to me, it's I just actually finished mine. I worked out this morning and it usually takes me another like hour to continue drinking it because I try to make
Yes.
sure I get it all down in an hour and a half so that I can utilize, I need all of it after working out hard. So,
Yeah, I must say I make it in the morning, but then it takes
yep.
me hours to
Yep.
finish. So it's good. And so where can people learn more about your programs and book launch, stay on the mailing list?
Yeah. Easiest thing is to join my mailing list. So www.cynthiathurlow.com. You can access to the Midlife Pause supplements. You get on the wait list for the program, and you can also listen to the podcast Everyday Wellness. Someone asked me the other day if I'm going to change the name, and I was like, I'm not ready to do that yet. Everyday Wellness, which is probably my favorite thing I do in my business. I get to interview really interesting, exciting, insightful people. And hopefully I'll be able to have Debbie on this summer. I know we've talked around it, but we'll have to make sure we make it
I
come to
know
fruition.
time goes by so fast. I know life's busy. It's so amazing. Well, I'm so impressed of everything you do, and I'm a big fan, obviously. And I always laugh because I see you in every group and our nutritional therapy, and you spoke with our FDN group, and you're on my LinkedIn groups. And so I appreciate everything you're doing to create impact in women's life, and so we can thrive the second half of our life. Because I don't think we should settle and accept that I'm going to have hot flashes. I am going to get fat. I'm going to have brain fog, but giving women the tools to have in their toolbox so how to navigate through this time of life and beyond is important.
Absolutely. Thank you again for having me.